There are some stories buried so deep in America's soil that even the locals refuse to whisper them aloud. The kind of story where bloodlines twist upon themselves, where shame breeds silence, and where entire generations vanish under the weight of their own secrets. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This one comes from a forgotten stretch of forest near the Kentucky-Tennessee border, a place locals call Red Hollow. No one marks it on maps anymore. The roads there have been reclaimed by vines, the cabins collapsing into their own rot. But in 1972, a county worker found something strange buried in those woods, an old birth record, sealed inside a rusted tobacco tin. It listed the mother and the father as members of the same family, only one generation apart. The handwriting was trembling, almost hesitant, as if whoever wrote it was confessing more than documenting. The mother's name was Clara Mae Hensley, the father, her own nephew. The story that unravels from that single name will drag you deep into one of America's most disturbing family tragedies, a horror born not of monsters, but of isolation, ignorance, and blood that never left the same soil. They say the Hensleys still linger somewhere in those woods, faces familiar, yet wrong, voices that echo a little too close to home. Tonight, we'll trace their forgotten lineage, uncovering the truth that generations of locals tried to erase. But remember, some bloodlines were never meant to be remembered. When you start digging into Red Hollow's history, you realize how much of it was designed to be forgotten. The town wasn't on any official registry after 1954. Before that, census reports show only 14 families, most of them sharing the same 3 last names. Among them were the Hensleys, a clan that had lived on the same patch of land for more than a century. They rarely left, and outsiders rarely came in. The locals used to say the Hensleys had earth blood, meaning their roots were so deep in that soil that even God couldn't pull them out. But isolation has a cost. The earliest records describe the family as hardworking, quiet, and oddly close. But by the 1940s, whispers started spreading through nearby towns. Children born with sunken chests, crossed eyes, or speech that slurred like sleep talk. There were rumors of relatives marrying cousins, uncles raising sons who were also nephews. No one dared to question it out loud, not in a region that prided itself on minding its own business. Then came the tragedy that sealed the town's fate. In 1951, a fire destroyed the main road bridge that connected Red Hollow to the nearest county seat. It was never rebuilt. The government marked the area as uninhabited by 1960. But that wasn't true. The Hensleys were still there, a handful of them surviving off the land, unseen, untouched, left to themselves. Clara Mae Hensley was born into that silence. She was the daughter of Ruth Hensley and an unknown father. Some said it was a traveling preacher. Others whispered it was someone closer to home. She was known for her beauty, pale skin, bright eyes, and hair the color of old corn silk. But the beauty of Red Hollow never lasted long. When Clara turned 15, the family stopped letting her go into town. The excuse was that she was too delicate for the world. The truth, as later found in that rusted tin, was much. The first sign that something was wrong came on a gray morning in the fall of 1968. The town sheriff, James Larkin, received an anonymous letter postmarked from a nearby gas station. The writing was childlike, shaky, but clear enough to read, "There's a baby coming in Red Hollow, and it ain't right." The sheriff, an old man who had spent his life chasing drunks and petty thieves, didn't take it seriously at first. But something about the uneven handwriting, letters pressed too deep into the paper, made him keep it in his desk drawer. Weeks later, a traveling salesman went missing on Route 51, just miles from where the old bridge once stood. His car was found with the keys still in the ignition, the front seat stained with something that looked like mud, or maybe blood. The locals whispered that he must have taken the wrong turn into the hollow. That's when Sheriff Larkin decided to drive out there himself. He followed the dirt road as far as his truck would go, tires cracking over roots and bone-dry soil. Then he saw it, a flicker of smoke rising from a distant chimney. Someone was still living in those woods. When he finally reached the clearing, he found a handful of cabins half buried in vines, their windows stuffed with newspaper. In one, an old man sat rocking on a porch, watching him without expression. Inside another, he heard muffled crying. The crying came from a young woman's voice, soft, broken, repeating one name over and over. Eli, Eli. The sheriff later wrote that it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. He never found the baby that day. And when he asked the old man about it, the man simply said, "Ain't no baby here, sir. Only what God left behind." Within a week, Larkin filed his final report on the incident. It was brief. Area deserted, locals uncooperative, no signs of life. Then he locked the letter back in his drawer and never spoke of Red Hollow. By 1971, Red Hollow had become a ghost of itself. Maps no longer marked it, and even county workers refused to drive that way. But stories lingered. Hunters claimed to hear crying in the woods at night, sometimes a woman's voice, sometimes something else. And then there was the Hensley place, the only cabin still standing with smoke in its chimney. That's where Clara Mae was said to live. With her nephew, Eli Hensley was 16 when his parents died in a logging accident. He'd been left under Clara's care since he was a child. Locals remembered seeing them together before the bridge burned down, a quiet pair who kept to themselves. But something had changed in those years of isolation. When a passing mail carrier once glimpsed Clara and Eli through the window, he described it later as wrong. They sat too close, eyes fixed on each other, like two people who'd forgotten what normal looked like. Inside the hollow, bloodlines had turned in on themselves. The Hensleys had no visitors, no church, no doctor. Generations of poverty and isolation had blurred their understanding of family. To them, love and lineage had become one and the same. And so, when Clara began to show signs of pregnancy, there was no one there to ask how, or to tell her it wasn't right. The midwife who once tended to births in those parts said she was called out there one night in late October. She found Clara in labor on the floor of her cabin, Eli beside her, silent, pale as candle wax. The child, she said, came into the world without a sound. The midwife didn't stay long enough to see what they did next. She ran out before dawn, muttering about eyes that didn't match the rest of the face. When officials finally rediscovered Red Hollow a year later, they counted only 2 living souls, Clara Mae and Eli. No sign of a baby, no grave, no record. The midwife had vanished soon after. And from that moment, Red Hollow's last bloodline began to rot in silence. Decades later, in the spring of 1994, the forest around Red Hollow was marked for clearance by a small logging company. No one alive then remembered the Hensleys, and the workers thought they were cutting into nothing more than forgotten land. But on their 3rd week, one of them, a man named Dale Foster, stumbled across a half-collapsed cabin. Inside, everything was still, dust coating the remains of a table, 2 chairs, and a cradle made of rough-hewn pine. It looked like no one had been there for years. Then he noticed the smell. Behind the stove, buried beneath a pile of rotting fabric, Dale found a small wooden box nailed shut. The box was wrapped in a strip of cloth that had once been white, now the color of dried rust. When he pried it open, the contents made him drop his flashlight. Inside were 2 small bone fragments and a tattered scrap of paper that read, "He came from me." Authorities were called, but when they arrived, the cabin had burned. The fire started before dawn, spreading so fast that even the surrounding trees caught flame. Dale swore he hadn't gone back there. He swore he'd left everything as it was. But the sheriff who took his statement said his hands were shaking so badly, he couldn't even sign his name right. Forensic teams combed through what was left of the hollow, uncovering relics of a life that had been buried by time. A porcelain doll's head, a child's shoe, and old jars filled with cloudy liquid that no one wanted to open. In one jar, they found what looked like hair. Another contained a single tooth. The fire was ruled an accident, the kind that happens when dry wood meets lightning. But there were no storms that night. Locals began saying the hollow had burned itself clean, as if the land was finally tired of holding on to its secrets. And yet, in the county archives, a single photograph remains from the recovery site, a blur. Years later, a graduate student named Melissa Grant stumbled upon the story while researching closed communities for her anthropology thesis. Red Hollow wasn't on any official records, but a passing mention in a 1950s social services report caught her attention. A handwritten note scrawled at the bottom that read, "One family remains unassisted by state welfare. Hensley." Melissa spent weeks tracking down what little information survived. Old county clerks, faded documents, scattered whispers from neighboring towns. Most dismissed her questions, warning her not to go digging where the past wanted to stay buried. But she didn't listen. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when it begins to sound like obsession. In 2001, she finally made her way into the hollow itself. She carried a camera, a recorder, and a notebook full of dates. What she found there didn't make sense. The cabins were gone, reduced to piles of moss-covered timber, but the air was heavy, still and damp, as if holding its breath. Then, just as daylight began to fade, she saw it. A crude wooden cross rising from the earth, carved with the words, "For him who came from me." She took a photograph, then began digging near the base with a small trowel. A few inches down, she hit something soft, fabric maybe, or skin. She froze. From beneath the dirt, a smell leaked out, sweet, rotten, and unmistakably human. She backed away, shaking, but curiosity forced her to take one more picture. In the camera's flash, she caught what looked like a child's face, pale, half-formed, impossibly preserved. Melissa never released that photograph publicly. 2 months later, she withdrew from the university and vanished during a solo drive to deliver her notes to a professor in Tennessee. Her car was found abandoned on the highway shoulder, the passenger seat holding her recorder. On the tape, only one phrase played again. By the summer of 2002, Red Hollow was back under quiet surveillance. The sheriff's office placed no trespassing signs around the old boundary, but they were more a warning than a law. No one wanted to go near that place, not after what happened to Melissa. Yet curiosity again found another victim. A small paranormal team from Ohio came to document the hollow for a low-budget documentary. Only one of them ever spoke about what they saw, and even then, not for long. The team arrived just before dusk, setting up old camcorders and audio recorders in the hollow's clearing. The forest was unnaturally silent. No wind, no birds, only the low hum of insects fading with the light. When they replayed the first hour of their footage, they heard what sounded like faint breathing over the static, followed by a single word whispered from somewhere close, "Clara." They thought it was a trick of the echo, until one of the team members noticed a shape moving behind the tree line. At first they assumed it was an animal, but when the light from their lantern hit the figure, they froze. It was a woman, thin, barefoot, her skin unnaturally pale, her hair hanging in long clumps as if wet. Her face was obscured by shadow, but the outline of her eyes reflected like glass. She moved toward them slowly, her arms trembling as though holding something invisible. And then, just before she vanished into the dark, one of the team swore they saw a smaller shape behind her, like a child crawling through the brush on all fours. They ran. One camera was dropped, recovered weeks later by authorities. The final frame showed the entrance to the hollow at dawn. In the distance, 2 figures stood near the burned cabin's remains, still, silent, watching. The film ends abruptly, the last second filled with the faint sound of a baby's cry layered under the wind. The official report called it mass hyster. Today, Red Hollow no longer appears on any map. The trees have reclaimed the roads, and the only signs of life are the faint outlines of fences half buried beneath moss. But every so often, hikers wandering too far off the trail report strange sounds at dusk, soft lullabies echoing through the trees, or the faint cry of an infant where no child could possibly be. When rangers go to check, they find nothing but empty clearings and disturbed soil, as if something had been crawling just beneath the surface. The legend of Clara Mae and Eli Hensley survives only through whispers and those who dare to look too closely at county archives. The birth record found in that tobacco tin was eventually traced to a local midwife. Her signature matched one from a 1940s register. The final notation on the record, scribbled faintly in pencil, simply read, "Still living, though not for long." No one knows what became of the Hensley bloodline. Some say the fire destroyed the last of them. Others believe the child survived, hidden deep in the hollow's tangled roots. Whatever truth remains is older than reason, older than shame. The story of Red Hollow isn't just about one family. It's about what happens when isolation festers, when the lines between love, loyalty, and sin blur into one suffocating silence. There's a certain horror that doesn't need monsters or murderers. It's the horror of what people can become when they have no one left to tell them no, when the same faces stare back for generations until even the reflection forgets who it belongs to. If you ever find yourself driving through southern Kentucky and notice the trees growing closer, thicker, darker, turn back before the road disappears. Because somewhere deep in those woods, beneath roots older than any name, lies the cradle of a child born from his own blood. And sometimes, on quiet nights, the wind still carries a whisper through the hollow, a woman's voice calling softly, "Eli."